Superman's red trunks nearly vanished from live action forever. For decades, studios treated that simple piece of fabric as an embarrassment, quietly stripping it away suit by suit, until the character looked less like a symbol and more like armor. One small design choice would end up deciding whether Hope still had a place on screen. Kirk Alyn, Superman 1948, the first man to ever wear the Superman suit on screen, didn't design anything. He just copied the comic panel and hoped nobody would notice the seams. That's the whole story of Kirk Alyn's costume in Columbia's 1948 serial. Blue bodysuit, red trunks, red boots, red cape, a chest emblem so big it looks like someone photocopied the comic cover and stapled it to his shirt. Nobody asked if it would work in real life. The only question was whether it matched the page, and it did, almost exactly. That faithfulness came at a cost. The fabric was thin, cheap, the kind of material you'd expect from a 15-part serial with a budget that couldn't stretch to anything sturdier. The S-shield itself was oversized and roughly stitched, a print-to-screen translation nobody had attempted before and nobody quite knew how to solve. When Superman needed to fly, the production didn't even trust the suit to sell it. They cut to animation instead, because a grown man in a bedsheet cape wasn't convincing anyone he was airborne. And yet, Alyn wore that exact costume again 2 years later in Atom Man vs. Superman, which tells you this wasn't a mistake they were rushing to fix. This was the look. Trunks and all, fans today call it charming, cheap, sure, but charming, closer to a stage costume than anything you'd call cinematic. That's not an insult so much as an origin story. Somewhere in a kid's living room, staring up at a flickering screen, that crude blue suit was still the first time Hope had a shape and a color. Nobody was embarrassed by the trunks yet. Nobody had decided they were a problem, but the very next Superman would learn that copying the comic exactly could actually make you look wrong. And the fix was putting on the wrong colors entirely, on purpose. George Reeves. The most iconic Superman costume of the 1950s was never actually red and blue. Not once, not on a single day of filming. That is not an exaggeration. It is the literal truth of how George Reeves's Adventures of Superman got made starting in 1952. The show shot in black and white, and true comic book red and blue turned into a muddy, lifeless gray on early cameras. So the crew did the only thing that made sense. They lied to the fabric. Reeves's suit swapped in grayish and brownish tones, sometimes brownish boots, sometimes a lighter shield, all calibrated for how light bounced off a lens instead of how it looked to the naked eye. Stand next to Reeves on set and the costume looked slightly off, almost wrong. Point a camera at him and you got the cleanest, most convincing Superman audiences had ever seen. The fit mattered too. Reeves wore a more streamlined bodysuit than Alyn's, cut tighter and smoother, giving Superman an actual silhouette instead of a loose approximation of one. The cape got a broader, more dramatic drape, the kind that photographs like a hero even hanging still. Even the S-shield shrank down and sharpened up, engineered so it would not blur into a smudge on a fuzzy 1950s television screen. Millions of kids grew up staring at that screen convinced they were watching the real thing, a bright and simple hero in red and blue. And that memory became the emotional template for what Superman was supposed to look like. Nothing in the historical record suggests anyone at the studio cared whether that memory lined up with reality. They just needed it to work on the equipment they had that year. So the very first mass television Superman was already a compromise, a costume built to trick a camera into believing something the human eye never actually saw. 2 decades of that kind of trickery, working around limitations, faking colors nobody could really see, and then someone handed the character an actual movie screen and asked audiences to believe something far harder than a costume. They asked them to believe a man could fly. Christopher Reeve. In 1978, a man in bright blue lycra and red trunks flew across a movie screen, and audiences believed it. Not cool special effects believed it. Actually believed a man could fly. That reaction is the whole point. Before this suit, nobody had proven that comic book brightness could survive contact with a real camera, a real budget, and a real human body. Yvonne Blake designed the costume, and she did not soften a single color to make it feel more grounded. Royal blue bodysuit, red trunks, red cape, a yellow and red S-shield pulled almost directly off the page. No armor plating, no muted tones, nothing apologizing for what it was. The cape alone did more heavy lifting than most costume pieces in film history. Blake used a heavier flowing fabric specifically so it would catch air and move with weight during the flying sequences, the ones that made 1978 audiences genuinely gasp in theaters. That cape had a job, and the job was to sell impossible physics using nothing but fabric and camera work. Behind the scenes, the production was not running one suit. They built several, subtly adjusted for flying rigs, close-up shots, and underwater filming, all tailored tightly to Reeves' lean frame to keep one consistent silhouette no matter what the scene demanded. That consistency is why the whole thing reads as effortless instead of stitched together. Here is the part that actually matters, decades later. This costume became the ruler every future Superman suit gets measured against. The proportions, the color balance, the way the cape sits on the shoulders. And for a generation of fans who looked up and saw that shape against the sky, this was not a superhero movie prop. It was proof that hope could look powerful instead of naive, which makes what happened to that hope over the following decades sting a little more, because once Superman left the big screen for a weekly network schedule, that same mythic silhouette suddenly had a problem. It looked too big, too grand, too much like a god for a man who now had to convince you he lived down the street. Dean Cain. Nobody in 1993 set out to break Superman. They just wanted him to fit on a television budget and a weekly shooting schedule. A small, boring compromise, and that is exactly where the crack started. Lois and Clark kept the trunks, kept the cape. On paper, it looks like the exact same suit Christopher Reeve wore into theaters 15 years earlier. But look closer at the blue and it is noticeably darker, pulled down from that bright storybook primary into something closer to what a real fabric would actually look like under studio lights. The S-shield got bigger too, stretched wider across the chest, with a yellow background bumped up in brightness, specifically so it would not wash out on a standard definition broadcast. That is, a technical fix, plain and simple. It is also the first time the emblem stopped being purely symbolic and started being engineered for a screen instead of a sky. Then there is the fit. Reeves' suit hung on him like a legend, loose enough to feel timeless, cut for a frame that read as mythic rather than muscular. Cain's suit did the opposite. It was tailored tight to his actual athletic build, and across the show's run, the fabric got adjusted again and again, thinner in places, sturdier in others, all in service of comfort during stunts and 12-hour shoot days. Nothing in the record says the studio held a meeting about turning Superman into a regular guy, but follow the pattern. Every choice, the color, the tailoring, the practicality points in the same direction toward a suit that looked like something an actual man could wear to work and still convincingly throw a punch. That is the quiet part fans still argue about decades later. Some call it the first casual superhero, a suit that finally looked lived in instead of worshipped. Others call it exactly what killed the awe. The moment the guy in the sky started looking like the guy next door, either red means the same thing happened. The suit that once told an entire generation hope could look effortless just took its first step toward looking ordinary instead. And once that door cracked open, the next version of Superman would spend 10 years worth of episodes deciding whether to walk through it at all or slam it shut for good. Tom Welling, Smallville 2011. 10 seasons. That is how long Smallville made its audience wait to see Tom Welling in a real Superman suit. And when it finally happened, you barely got to look at it. The obvious move after a decade of teasing is a full reveal. Camera front and center, hero pose, the whole thing. Smallville had other plans. The 2011 finale gives Welling the blue bodysuit, the red cape, the classic S-shield, and then immediately hides it from you, shooting him from behind, from a distance, half in shadow. Like the show itself got nervous at the last second. For years, the series dressed Clark Kent in leather jackets and vague proto-suits, treating the real costume like a myth too dangerous to touch directly. Then it finally built one that looked exactly like the comic book version everyone had been waiting a decade for, and still refused to give it a clean daylight shot. Most of what fans actually know about the suit's construction, the stitching, the texture, the exact shade of blue, comes from promotional stills and behind-the-scenes photos, not the episode itself. 0 sustained hero shots, 0 full-body reveals in clear light. Not one. The finale marks the exact moment Clark stops running from being Superman, which makes the costume symbolically enormous and visually almost invisible at the same time. That contradiction is not an accident. It is the same grounded instinct that kept turning capes into leather jackets all season long, just pushed one final step further. The realism did not simply darken the suit this time. It made the show flinch from even showing it. Like the classic look had somehow gotten too bright, too pure, too embarrassing to film head-on after 10 years of gritty reinvention. Somewhere in that finale is a version of the fantasy every kid who watched this show actually wanted. The bright, hopeful guy in the primary colors, standing out in the open for everyone to see. Smallville built that exact costume and then could not bring itself to point the camera at it directly. Fans still argue about whether that counts as a payoff or a con. Some call it restraint, a fittingly quiet ending for a show that always resisted spectacle. Others call it 10 years of buildup for a suit you mostly have to imagine. And honestly, that argument is hard to lose. Either way, the costume exists mostly in stills, not in memory. which is a strange way to end a show about a guy finally becoming Superman. If one Superman was too shy to show its suit, the next big-budget film would go the opposite way entirely, sculpting every seam in loving, obsessive detail while quietly draining the color out of Hope itself, Brandon Routh. A movie built as a love letter to 1978 is the exact movie that started dimming the lights on it, and almost nobody clocked it in real time. Superman Returns landed in 2006 as a direct spiritual sequel to the Christopher Reeve era, right down to lifting John Williams' score and casting Routh for his uncanny resemblance to Reeve himself. The intent was reverence. Preserve the icon. Honor the original. But look closely at what actually changed and the tribute starts arguing with itself. The blue goes darker and more muted, pulling away from the bright primary tone that made the 1978 suit look like it was lit from inside. The red trunks shrink. The S-shield gets lifted off the chest into a raised, three-dimensional emblem with sharper, more sculpted lines, and a miniature version shows up again on the belt buckle, as if one Superman symbol per suit was suddenly not enough. The cape moves higher onto the shoulders and carries its own subtle S motif stitched into the back. Every individual choice reads as an upgrade. Stacked together, they add up to something else entirely. The whole costume starts leaning ceremonial instead of hopeful, more statue than symbol. And that shift matters because somewhere in a theater is a kid who grew up on the bright version, the one that looked like it belonged in daylight, and is now watching that same figure get quietly dressed for a funeral. The fit was so tight and the material so textured that Routh reportedly struggled with basic comfort across long shooting days, which is a strange price to pay for a suit that was supposedly playing it safe. Fans still argue about it. Some call it the most elegant Superman ever put on screen. Others say shrinking the trunks and draining the color was the first real crack in the armor, no pun intended. Shrinking the trunks was a compromise. The very next Superman would stop compromising entirely and do the one thing no mainstream live-action film had ever dared. Take them off completely. Man of Steel. The trunks did not shrink this time. They disappeared completely, and the movie handed you a receipt explaining why that was totally normal. Routh's suit had already thinned them down to a compromise nobody loved and nobody hated. This suit just deleted the argument entirely. 2013 gave Henry Cavill a costume with zero trunks, a deep blue textured bodysuit covered in raised Kryptonian patterning, a red S-shield sitting on a muted, almost bronze-yellow background, and a cape so heavy it reportedly took real physical effort just to move in. The excuse was built right into the plot itself. This was not a costume choice, the film insisted. It was alien battle armor pulled from a Kryptonian scout ship, stitched from technology older than Earth. Every ridge and texture got a lore explanation stapled to it. The muscle-hugging, almost sculpted construction was framed as Kryptonian engineering flexing to fit Cavill's physique, which, sure, also happened to match exactly what every other superhero movie was doing that decade. That is the part worth sitting with. An in-universe justification does not erase a design decision, it just gives that decision better cover. And this is the design decision that finally finished the job. The trunks were not softened, faded, or reworked one more time. They were written out of continuity completely, replaced with a story about armor, so nobody had to say the real reason out loud. A piece of Superman's silhouette had quietly become something people were embarrassed by. Think about what that means for the kid who used to look up and see primary colors and zero ambiguity. That kid is not in this movie. This Superman is armored, textured, and ceremonial, dressed like a war relic instead of a promise. The trunks were never coming back after this, not for years, and every suit that followed built directly on top of this exact decision like it was settled law. It was not the last stop either. Once you have stripped Superman down to armor and alien texture, there is only one place darker left to go, and the next version drained out whatever color this one still had left. Black and silver. Superman comes back from the dead, and the first thing Hope does is disappear entirely. Not fade, not dim, disappear. In Zack Snyder's Justice League, the suit that resurrects him is black and silver. And for a franchise that had already stripped away trunks and softened the primary colors into something moodier, this is the finish line. Red and blue built Superman as a beacon. Black and silver builds him as a man who just clawed out of a coffin. The design underneath hasn't changed. Same textured bodysuit, same oversized chest emblem, same lines that defined the Man of Steel costume years earlier. What changed is everything the color used to say. Metallic silver replaces gold. Black replaces the blue. Even the cape goes black, which means when he stands next to Batman or Wonder Woman or Aquaman on screen, he's the darkest thing in the frame instead of the brightest. This is not an accident, and it is not just aesthetic drift. It's a direct reference to a specific comic run, the recovery look Superman wore after his own resurrection decades earlier, and that context is genuine canon, not a stretch. The story reason holds up. A man torn apart and rebuilt doesn't walk out in a clean cape. He walks out in something that looks like it survived a funeral. But notice what that means for the bigger picture. The single most literal, most story-justified dark suit in Superman's live-action history is also the one that proves the trend has gone as far as it can go. There's no more color left to remove. Every choice, from the trunks disappearing to the palette-going gunmetal, has been leading toward a version of Superman with zero warmth left in his wardrobe, and it happens at the exact moment he's at his most broken, grieving, and least himself. Fans loved it. Genuinely, enthusiastically loved it, calling it the coolest Superman has ever looked on screen. But even the people who loved it kept adding the same asterisk. Great for one scene, one arc, one resurrection. Nobody was asking for it to be the new normal, because a costume of loss only means something if you eventually take it off. Film had chased Superman all the way into black and silver, but a smaller, cheaper show on a different screen was about to do the one thing the movies kept flinching from, and prove hope was never the part that needed fixing. Tyler Hoechlin. A television budget did what $300 million movies couldn't. It made fans actually miss Superman. That's not a knock on the actors before him. It's what happened the moment Superman and Lois hit screens in 2021 wearing a suit nobody was hyping in trailers or magazine covers. No trunks, same as the movies. Same rulebook, same silhouette. But something about it landed different, and it took the internet about 5 minutes to figure out why. The blue is the whole story, where Cavill's suit had gone muted and metallic, practically gunmetal in some scenes. Hoechlin's version cranked the saturation back up into something closer to a comic panel. The cape is a real, bold red. The S-shield is bright, clean, and sized to actually read on a screen, because unlike a movie you watch once in a theater, this suit had to survive years of close-ups on a television budget in people's living rooms. There's subtle paneling, a bit of texture across the chest, just enough seams to suggest armor without pretending Superman needs it. It still had to survive wire rigs, stunt doubles, and a full season's worth of shooting days. So somebody made a suit that was durable first and dramatic second, and it worked anyway. Plenty of fans call this the suit that feels the most like Superman of the modern era. Brighter blue doing more emotional work than any amount of grimdark texturing ever did. That's not a small thing to say about a costume built on a fraction of a blockbuster's budget, because remember what the black and silver suit proved a few years earlier. Darkness was never a requirement, just the choice somebody kept making. This is the suit that quietly called that bluff. It kept every rule the movies had written. No trunks, still realistic, still grounded. It just refused to be gloomy about it, and it turns out that was the actual missing ingredient the whole time. Not grit, just light. Somewhere in that decision is a kid who grew up watching Superman fly through blue sky and red and blue and gold, who spent every year since watching that image get sanded down a little more. This suit didn't fully give it back. It just proved the light was never the problem. Brightening the blue was halfway home. The whole 40-year argument was still waiting on one piece of fabric, and one film was finally about to stop apologizing and put it back. David Corenswet, Superman 2025. Somebody finally had the nerve to put the underwear back on. That sounds like a joke. It is not. For 40 years, studios treated the red trunks like a design flaw that needed correcting, something to be quietly phased out as capes got darker and armor got heavier. David Corenswet's Superman puts them back on purpose, in broad daylight, on a poster. The official suit reveal for James Gunn's Superman does exactly what the last 2 decades of Superman movies refused to do. It keeps the structured cape and the bold chest shield, but underneath, the trunks are back, rendered in the same bright primary red and blue that defined the character before anyone decided he needed to look like he'd been through a war. The shield itself is retro in shape, but modern in texture, like classic comic art got run through actual tailoring instead of a photocopier. This is not a costume trying to apologize for being colorful. It is a costume that assumes colorful was the point all along. Gunn has said outright that he wants a more optimistic Superman, and the suit is the clearest evidence of that intention available before a single frame of footage exists. Everything currently known comes from stills and press, not the finished film, so nobody can promise how it moves, how it photographs in motion, or how it holds up under 3 hours of actual storytelling. But even in a still image, the message is loud. This is not a redesign trying to fix Superman. It's a costume that stopped treating him like a problem. The fan reaction split immediately, and predictably. Some see a return to form, decades overdue. Others worry the trunks will read as dated to an audience raised entirely on Snyder's muted blues and grays. Both reactions prove the same point. This piece of fabric still has the power to start a fight, which means it was never actually irrelevant. It was just unwelcome. Go back to Hoechlin lighting up television screens in unapologetic color while the movies stayed dark. Go back to every suit that swapped brightness for grit, every redesign that treated hope like something to be embarrassed about. None of those choices were really about fabric or trunks or shading. They were about whether a man who can fly and never lies was still allowed to look like it, without someone rolling their eyes. The trunks were never the outdated part. The fear that Hope looked silly was. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.